Good morning, everyone. I guess I'll start. I'll just put my dreaded timer so I don't open up the time. I'd first like to thank the committee that was in charge of putting together this accumulation of capital, accumulating capital territories of accumulation panel. I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss this topic with you. I'll start by telling you a little story about a special issue titled "And Now, Architecture Against a Developer Presidency" that was issued after November 27, 2016, which represented basically the election of Donald Trump. Contributions from critical urban theorists like Ananya Roy, Rachel Weber, and references to conceptual paradigms such as David Harvey's Spatial Fix, Thomas Piketty's Patrimonial Capitalism, and Cheryl Harris's 1993 Harvard Law Review concept of urbanism. To try and make sense of this inauguration that was happening, Donald Trump, since then dubbed the new developer-in-chief, as we had to prepare for times of infrastructure exclusion, deportation, bombastic architectures that would more than ever monumentalize and engineer the concentration of wealth. All contributors agree that as planners, architects, designers, policymakers, we basically had a duty not to be acquiescent or complicit of that developer-in-chief. Since by essence it is hard for our professions not to be the ones building the boundaries between the haves and the have-nots, this call for critical action basically motivated the project I'm presenting and workshopping with you today. In New York, since the mandatory inclusionary housing program was proposed in 2014 by Mayor Bill de Blasio, several neighborhoods were selected to undergo rezonings that would eventually sort of implement this inclusionary zoning tool. As a reminder, how it works is basically the public sector channels private capital from real estate developers and requires them for each development project that they're going to work on to include a quota of certain affordable housing units. This is sort of a way to restructure the welfare state. It has all kinds of debates attached to it, particularly related to its benefits, but also its very dangerous externalities. All right, so as part of the pledge of Bill de Blasio to build or preserve approximately 200,000 units in the coming decade, the idea was to sort of try to rezone multiple neighborhoods around the city. One of these neighborhoods, East Harlem, which most of you know as Spanish Harlem, was selected to undergo this rezoning, and it illustrates, in my opinion, in the best way how controversial and conflictual this process has been. In this case, basically decision makers were accused of coming from a top-down level and sort of denying anything that was coming from the community level in terms of propositions, in terms of shifts and tweaks in the regulatory tool and how it was going to be implemented. And that happened during what we call the deliberative and participatory process of ULURP, which is the moment when the mayoral administration and the elected officials sort of try to consult with the representatives at the neighborhood level to try and craft something that is more consensual. What was the biggest problem in this case was that developers were accused of taking advantage of the different four formulas that are offered to them to try and basically include affordable housing units. They were doing something whereby they were not offering enough housing units, they were not touching deeply enough the lowest income households that were mostly in need of those units in the specific neighborhood. Which brings me to what I want to talk about today. I'm interested in this idea that behind such inclusionary zoning tools that are defined in a very positive way, very standard way, there are actually agents that shape the law at different stages of the implementation process, as you can see it here. And this is sort of going to complicate whatever outcomes are attached to the program from the moment it gets adopted to what outcomes are attached to it down the line. This partly explains why so often there's an important gap between the initial goals that are announced and then the final outcomes. So let me situate you a little bit. This is a trend of quite representative of the state of housing construction in New York City that illustrates a shift that has been taking place since the mid-70s and early 80s. What is referred to as the neoliberal era is this category of pro-growth policy models that are specifically circulating as remedies to challenges faced by the welfare state in its very standard and classical form in multiple urban contexts. Approaches to housing construction have started to implement more and more of these hybrid public-private sort of tools and relied more than ever on the private sector. This is obviously even more so the case as decision makers are facing a lot of problems finding innovative ways to sort of tackle the housing affordability crisis from both the quantitative side, providing enough units, and also the affordability side, providing units for the people most in need, especially in a local housing market that is extremely heated like the one of New York. So why does this topic matter? There's three ways that I can identify why MIH should be defined by looking at territories of accumulation paradigms. One, because of the controversies that it's generating. Basically, inclusionary zoning programs are in turn referred to as Trojan horses because they're bringing into neighborhoods that are really not made to sustain such development projects. Mostly private real estate, large developments that are going to include, yes, a few, housing units that are affordable, but it's considered more likely like small firefighter approaches, incremental deals that we really don't know how to measure outcomes attached to it. And we're not sure that it's really fixing the affordability crisis. Actually, empirical studies are showing that it might do the opposite. So it triggers both unabashed celebration and heated contestation. Second way to define why I'm looking at this topic is the political agendas that it's carrying with it. MIH has been the signature policy tool of the mayoral administration of de Blasio. He got reelected using a lot of arguments around this tool. And he argues that it's the most progressive, specifically inclusionary zoning tool in the country right now, and that it's the most restrictive as well, because we shifted from what used to be voluntary to something that's absolutely mandatory without necessarily possibilities to go build them in a forest far away, or which was the case for a really long time. Meanwhile, it is also sort of the train that carries with it the ambitions of community organizers, community representative organizations, because, and you'll see it, I'll discuss that, they've been really working around insurgent actions against City Hall to try and carry with them the contestation of such programs and their implementation. A third way to look at the importance of this topic is really through the social spatial transformations that they generate in the city. Again, I'm interested in urban economics, but to echo my colleague, I look at it from the perspective of more, the spatial sort of component of that. I'm a geographer by training, an urban planner, and I'm super obsessed with urban politics. So this social spatial transformations, we can quantify them. Basically, this is the baby of something that started in the 70s when New York was facing the biggest fiscal crisis. And Mayor Ed Koch back then developed this voluntary inclusionary program that was then carried on by one of his successors, Michael Bloomberg. And if you look at it, it was a major component of restructuring in the city. From 2002 to 2013, 37% of Manhattan was rezoned to include inclusionary zoning. So it's a big chunk of the whole island that was restructured through that. This paper draws from an empirical mixed method study, and basically policies analyzed through, like I said, the lens of accumulation and dispossession, but it has only been about 2 years since the program was launched. And for this reason, I set out to answer the following question. How do the different authorities and players that are involved in this rezoning sort of negotiate with each other to craft the implementation of the tool? And then why does such a seemingly progressive policy, which carries with it a lot of potential, ends up being dispossessive in its outcome, generating displacement and exclusion for us? This is inscribed in an urban politics approach, and therefore constitutes the starting point of a theoretical proposition that I think sees in the deals and transactions behind inclusionary zoning models the continuation of dispossessive policies, this family of dispossessive policies, and neoliberal strategies of accumulation of capital. The conceptual literature that I invoke is threefold. First, I try to look at all the discourses, strategies, and frameworks that justify why such programs are implemented, why they're diffused and adopted from one city to the other. It's really interesting to see how they're transferred from one municipality to the other, just in North America, but also looking at it cross, transatlantic ways as well. That's the first sort of lens that I look at. A second lens is more about how implementation of such regulatory tools end up constantly being complicated because they are implemented in super delicate, complicated power and political arenas that are going to be subject to delicate power balances, conflicts of interest, etc. And that brings me to why it basically ends up not reversing the sort of genealogies of exclusion and segregation that it's supposed to fix, but actually recycling them at the end of the day. And that's when I describe it in a literature on neighborhood effects and path dependency of policy tools. So this empirical mixed method study, I'm not going to dive into all the elements of it, although I can tackle that during the Q&A, but I decided today to focus on a more qualitative appreciation of the growing opposition to it. The rezoning process, like I said, in East Ireland started in 2016, and the ULURP, Uniform Land Use Review Procedure process, was then launched. And basically public hearings were held in order to decide whether the project was going to be viable or not for the neighborhood. This matters to me because, like I said, I'm interested in how it brought to the table all kinds of stakeholders, the elected officials, the developers, the community representatives, and the residents. And this participatory process was carried out by City Council Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito. A dream of mine is to write a political biography of her, or an analysis of her strategies, because she was from the neighborhood, went to the top-down level, developed something thinking that she was doing the most spatially just program, giving a gift to the neighborhood, and was welcomed with obviously the worst and harshest contestation ever, being called a traitor, etc. Well, that's a side project. So you combine Melissa and Mark Viverito's efforts, the Community Board 11 efforts, and then the community organization, Community Voices Heard. And my 3-year work included semi-structured exploratory interviews with all these people, community group representatives, elected officials, and also real estate developers, to try and understand how they came about negotiating with each other. And what I found, and I'm here presenting just 2 categories of findings for the sake of time, is how coalitions and controversies were tied with each other, and sort of explain why a progressive program ended up being dispossessive. So I'll first start with the coalition's findings. They manifested during protests in and outside the hearing rooms, the distribution and signing of petitions, the mobilization of speakers to come and testify during hearings and outside of these hearing rooms. MIH, as it was inscribing itself in a neighborhood that's really defined and characterized by a context of distrust against planners, against all kinds of other developers, other stakeholders as well, had basically a different meaning for each coalition. So there was a sort of problem of communication between the different groups of stakeholders or coalitions. It meant power. MIH was power for city officials, versus it meant the possibility to capitalize and develop the city for real estate developers. And then for community representatives and residents, it meant, so long as it was tweaked and sort of reshaped, which did not happen, a resource for residential stability. That was the main thing that we were looking at. This triggered controversies that I'm going to categorize quickly, basically tied to an analysis that I have been doing that was fueled by the interviews I performed, whereby each time somebody was mentioning a different type or category of controversy, I would try and back it up with empirical analysis. So for instance, the references constantly to the fact that it was targeting specifically lower income neighborhoods with concentration and considering a household below the poverty level called for first a mapping of this. Another controversy that was always tied to MIH implementation was that it was generating neighborhood change, something that needs a little bit more years to analyze the actual impacts on affordability of rental prices, property values, something that I'm doing right now at the moment. But if you look at it, just looking at a few years at the census tract level, you can analyze, just by mapping it, how it's targeting specific areas that are more or less rent-burdened and how the ratio of rent-burdened households has evolved over time. And it shows you that it's targeting gentrifying neighborhoods. Something that I'm also trying to sort of double check by looking, sorry, you see I'm measuring myself, you don't even have to tell me. Something that I'm double checking by looking at regression-based analysis to try and measure whether or not the impacts are negative so much as people are saying it. So the discourse of opponents is really revolving around that, and it reveals two mismatches. First mismatch is a quantitative approach that is developed at the top-down level. They want to come up with 200,000 units in the next decade, and actually it increased. Since Mayor de Blasio was elected a year ago, he now wants to do 300,000 either preserve or develop. And this is clashing with a more neighborhood, finer-grained geographic approach to this program and this policy, where people are really, and it triggers more conflict. People are not agreeing, and they're clashing upon which neighborhood has to be prioritized, which parcel has to be prioritized, and how they're going to go about doing that. A second mismatch is really between the expert view at the mayor's office and then the vernacular view of residents who are really not agreeing on how to go about developing this or implementing this tool. So the very nature of it is not necessarily the problem, it's just about how to go about implementing it. In conclusion, a review of the literature and everything that policymakers and people involved have been doing shows that there hasn't been enough studying of the internal politics and the power relations attached to implementation of such tools. A political economy of inclusionary zoning, particularly this model, has not been performed, and that's basically what I'm hoping to do. I want to look at it also from a different perspective in terms of continuing my work on coalitions and controversies, but I think that East Harlem, even though it works as a snapshot of the problem with neighborhood planning right now in New York City, which is too tied in negotiations that are really more deals between stakeholders, I think it's just one version of the city, and we need to work on a more systematic typology of other rezoning cases, fascinating ones. The East New York one was the first one, the pioneer. It went really, really badly. Another one is the South Bronx case, which triggered with it a highly controversial sort of situation because it was a really large rezoning that was not carrying consensus. And then other ones that I will gladly talk about in the Q&A. Thank you so much.